The pen was an anchor. In Thomas Adler's hand was the ship it was determined to sink. It sat on the crisp white linen of the table at the crimson oak, a gleaming silver instrument of his own execution. Outside the panoramic windows, the New York City dawn was painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, a spectacle of hope that felt like a personal insult. Inside, the only light that mattered was the cold, sterile glow from the laptop screen displaying the final page of the Chapter 11 filing. 7:53 a.m. In 7 minutes, his lawyer, flanked by the man who had orchestrated this downfall, would arrive to witness the end. Everything he had built over 40 years, Adler Innovations, a titan of engineering and design, a testament to American ingenuity born in his father's garage, was about to be dissolved into legal jargon and creditors' claims. His fingers trembled, not with the cold of the overzealous air conditioning, but with the profound cellular rejection of a body refusing to participate in its own demise. It wasn't fear. Fear was a distant memory, a luxury from a time when there was still something left to lose. This was the quiet, hollow echo that comes after the loss is already complete. He was the only patron in the restaurant's private dining room, a space usually reserved for power lunches and celebratory dinners. Now it was his Gethsemane. The scent of brewing coffee and old leather, once a comfort, now seemed to mock him. A young woman, a waitress, moved silently at the edge of his vision. He'd noticed her before, a phantom in a black uniform, refilling water glasses that he never drank from, replacing silverware he would never use. She had a quiet efficiency about her, a way of moving that was unobtrusive yet deliberate. He could feel her occasional glances, not of pity. He'd had his fill of that from his board, his now estranged children, the society pages, but of something else, an unnerving, analytical curiosity. He picked up the pen. The weight of it was obscene. It was a gift from his late wife, Eleanor, for their 25th anniversary. To write the next chapter, she had said. How bitterly ironic that it would be used to write the last word. Mr. Adler? The voice was soft, hesitant, but clear. He didn't look up. I'm preparing for a meeting. The words were gravel in his throat. I know, sir. I'm sorry to intrude. He heard the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes on the polished mahogany floor. She was closer now. It's just, I think you're about to make a terrible mistake. That made him look up. She couldn't have been more than 25. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe functional ponytail, and her face, scrubbed clean of makeup, was framed by a few stray wisps that had escaped their confinement. Her name tag read, Grace. In one hand she held a silver tray with a single untouched croissant, in the other a coffee carafe. But it was her eyes that held him. They were a deep, intelligent brown, and they weren't looking at him with the deference of a service worker to a wealthy client. They were looking at the laptop screen, and they were sharp. Excuse me? His voice was a blade, honed by months of stress and betrayal. Grace didn't flinch. She placed the tray and carafe on a nearby sideboard, her movements economical and precise. She took a small, steadying breath. The documents, sir, on your screen. I've been clearing the tables around you for the last hour. I wasn't trying to pry, but the layout of the asset amortization schedule, it's structured to obscure, not to clarify. Thomas almost let out a laugh, a dry, humorless bark. A waitress was critiquing a multi-million-dollar bankruptcy filing prepared by one of the top law firms in the city. The absurdity was staggering. And what precisely would you know about asset amortization schedules? I know that when you bundle long-term depreciating assets with short-term liquid assets under a single consolidated liability, you create a false impression of insolvency, she said, her voice even, without a trace of arrogance. It was a simple statement of fact. It's a common tactic in hostile takeovers to devalue a company before a forced acquisition. It makes the debt look bigger and the assets look smaller than they actually are. Thomas stared at her. The words she used, consolidated liability, false impression of insolvency, hostile takeovers, were not the vocabulary of a waitress. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a year. Intrigue. It was a tiny spark in the vast, cold darkness of his despair. Who are you? He asked, the question genuine this time. My name is Grace Miller. I serve coffee here, she said. A shadow passed over her face, a fleeting memory of another life. But I used to study applied mathematics and forensic accounting at MIT. Before, before I had to leave. She didn't elaborate on the before, and the unspoken story hung in the air between them. He should have dismissed her. He should have told her to go back to her duties, to leave him to his ruin. But the quiet confidence in her eyes, the precision of her language, held him captive. And more than that, there was the searing truth of her observation. His protege, Marcus Thorne, the man he'd loved like a son, the man he'd been grooming to take over the company, was orchestrating a sale of the company's remnant assets to a competitor. A vulture fund called Titan Equity Group. Marcus had called it a necessary, if painful, restructuring. Grace had just called it what it was, a hostile takeover. "Why do you care?" Thomas asked, his voice softer. Grace's gaze met his, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt truly seen. Not as the caricature of the failed billionaire, but as a man on a precipice. "Because my father built a small construction company with his own two hands," she said, her voice dropping, gaining a raw personal edge. "He was a good, honest man. He got squeezed by a lender who used paperwork just like that to bankrupt him. They used confusing numbers to steal his life's work. He lost everything. I've seen what happens when good people get outmaneuvered by bad math." He saw it then. It wasn't pity in her eyes. It was recognition. It was righteous anger. The heavy glass doors of the private room swung open. Marcus Thorne strode in, his suit impeccably tailored, his smile a predatory slash of white. He was charisma and ambition poured into a $1,000 Tom Ford. Behind him was Arthur Peterson, Thomas's lawyer, a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in an expression of weary apology. "Thomas, good morning," Marcus said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. He glanced at Grace, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "We can take it from here, miss." It was a clear, condescending dismissal. Grace didn't move. She held Marcus's gaze for a fraction of a second before turning her attention back to Thomas. "It's 8 a.m., Thomas," Peterson said gently, opening his briefcase. "It's time." Marcus placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, a gesture that was meant to look supportive, but felt like a proprietary claim. "Let's get this over with, old man. End the suffering. We can all move on." "Move on to what, Marcus?" Thomas asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "To your new position at Titan Equity Group?" The smile on Marcus's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "We're all just trying to salvage what we can." Thomas looked from Marcus's polished facade to Grace's steady, waiting gaze. He had a choice. He could sign the papers, accept the narrative of failure spun by the man he had trusted, and fade into ignominy. Or he could listen to the impossible whisper of hope from a 25-year-old waitress in a quiet dining room. He had been fighting this battle with the wrong weapons: nostalgia, trust, a gentleman's code that Marcus had discarded long ago. Grace had just handed him a new one: cold, hard numbers. He pulled his hand back from the pen. "I'm not signing," Thomas said. The words felt strange in his own mouth, like a foreign language he was just learning to speak. But they felt right. Peterson froze, his hand hovering over a stack of papers. Marcus's bonhomie evaporated, replaced by a chilling stillness. "What are you talking about, Thomas? We've been over this. There's no other way." "This young lady," Thomas said, gesturing toward Grace, "has raised some interesting questions about the asset valuations in this filing, specifically about the deliberate obfuscation of their true worth." Marcus finally turned his full, venomous attention to Grace. "You've been listening to the help? Thomas, you're not well. The stress is getting to you. Miss, whatever he's paying you for this little performance, I'll double it. Now get out." Grace stood her ground. "He's not paying me anything. But I'd be happy to point out the discrepancies for your lawyer. For instance, the valuation of the patent portfolio for the hydro-ceramic composite. It's listed at its initial development cost, not its current market value, which after the recent aerospace contracts is at least 50 times higher. That's a $100 million error right there. Or shall we discuss the fabricated debt note from a shell corporation, Viridian Holdings, that just happens to be registered to a P.O. box in the Cayman Islands? A P.O. box, I bet, has a connection to Titan Equity Group. A dead silence fell over the room. Peterson's face had gone pale. He was a corporate lawyer, not a litigator. He facilitated deals, he didn't fight wars, and he looked terrified. But Marcus just stared at Grace, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure fury. The mask had slipped. Beneath the charming protege was something cold and reptilian. "You've been a busy little girl, haven't you?" Marcus hissed. "I pay attention to details," Grace replied evenly. "It's a skill that seems to be in short supply around here." Thomas felt a surge of adrenaline, a warrior's spirit he thought had died long ago. He stood up, the weariness of the past months sloughing off him like a heavy coat. "Arthur," he commanded, his voice ringing with its old authority, "you will not file these papers. You will go back to your office and you will launch a full, independent forensic audit of every single document Marcus has provided over the past 6 months. You will start with Viridian Holdings and the hydroceramic patent." "Thomas, this is insane," Marcus snarled, taking a step forward. "You're throwing away the only deal that can save a fraction of your legacy." "No, Marcus," Thomas said, his eyes locking with the man he had once mentored. "I'm finally starting to save it." He turned to Grace, who was standing quietly by the sideboard, her work seemingly done. "Miss Miller, I believe I have a sudden and urgent need for a consultant. Your hourly rate is whatever you say it is. My office, in 1 hour." Grace met his gaze and gave a single, sharp nod. "I'll be there." As she turned to leave, Marcus moved to block her path, his body radiating menace. "You have no idea what you've just done," he whispered to her, his voice low and threatening. Thomas stepped between them, placing himself directly in Marcus's path. He was older, smaller than Marcus, but at that moment he seemed to fill the room. "Get out of my way, Marcus, and get out of my company. You're fired." For a moment, the raw violence in Marcus's eyes made Thomas think he might actually strike him. But then Marcus composed himself, smoothing his suit jacket. He gave a short, ugly laugh. "You can't fire me, old man. You don't have a company anymore. You have a carcass, and the vultures are already circling. This little stunt changes nothing. The clock is still ticking." He turned and stormed out of the room, Peterson scurrying after him like a nervous rodent. The silence that descended was profound. It was just Thomas and Grace, standing in the opulent, empty room as the morning sun streamed in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The bankruptcy papers lay unsigned on the table, a battle deferred, not yet won. "He's right about one thing," Thomas said, his voice heavy. "The clock is ticking. Titan Equity won't just walk away." "Then we'd better get to work," Grace said, her voice calm and resolute. "You have a company to save, Mr. Adler." For the first time in over a year, Thomas Adler believed it might actually be possible. The next 48 hours were a blur of caffeine, legal pads, and frantic energy. Thomas Adler's penthouse office, usually a serene sanctuary of polished wood and panoramic views, had been transformed into a war room. The large mahogany desk was buried under stacks of financial reports, legal filings, and shareholder agreements. Grace Miller, who had arrived exactly 1 hour after the confrontation at the Crimson Oak, dressed in a simple but professional blouse and slacks she must have kept for emergencies, moved through the chaos with an unnerving calm. She wasn't just good with numbers, she was a prodigy. She saw patterns where others saw randomness, connections where others saw coincidence. While Thomas made calls to the few board members he still trusted, rallying what little support he could muster, Grace sat at his conference table, a laptop open, her focus absolute. She devoured spreadsheets, her fingers flying across the keyboard, cross-referencing internal audits with public filings, her brow furrowed in concentration. "He was sloppy," she murmured late into the first night, pointing to a line on the screen. Thomas, bleary-eyed and running on fumes, leaned over her shoulder. "What is it?" "Service contracts. For the last 18 months, Adler Innovations has been paying exorbitant fees for logistical consulting to 4 different companies. All 4 were incorporated in Delaware within the same week. All 4 list the same registered agent, and all 4 have been billing for identical services on overlapping dates." "Shell corporations," Thomas breathed, a cold knot of anger tightening in his gut. He was bleeding the company dry from the inside. "Worse," Grace said, her mouse clicking rapidly as she pulled up another window. He was using the payments to these companies to create artificial operational losses. These losses were the primary justification for the bankruptcy filing. He wasn't just stealing from you. He was manufacturing the crisis he claimed to be solving. The betrayal was so profound, so meticulously planned, it left Thomas speechless. It wasn't a crime of passion or a single act of greed. It was a long, calculated campaign of sabotage waged by the man he had treated as a son. He had invited the viper into his home, and it had slowly, methodically poisoned everything he loved. As they dug deeper, Grace's personal history began to color her investigation. While examining vendor contracts for a new construction project at one of Adler's manufacturing plants, her eyes narrowed. "Skyline Contracting," she read aloud. "I know that name. They're a major player in the city," Thomas said. "Marcus brought them in last year. Said our old partners weren't competitive enough." "Competitive isn't the word I'd use," Grace said, her voice laced with ice. "They're the firm that put my father out of business. They use predatory bidding, then inflate costs with fraudulent change orders and material surcharges. They bankrupt their subcontractors and use shell companies to hide the assets. My father fought them for 2 years. It broke him." She fell silent, but Thomas could see the ghost of that old battle in her eyes. It explained so much: her fierce intelligence, her refusal to be intimidated, her deep-seated need for justice. This wasn't just a job for her, it was a crusade. "Grace," he said softly, "I'm sorry." She shook her head, her focus returning to the screen with a renewed, steely intensity. "Don't be sorry. Let's get them." This personal connection provided the key. Grace knew Skyline's methods intimately. She knew what to look for. Within hours, she had unearthed a series of invoices from Skyline to Adler Innovations that were identical, down to the invoice numbers, to the fraudulent ones used against her father's company years ago. It was Marcus's fatal mistake. In his arrogance, he had used the same playbook, the same corrupt partners, assuming no one would ever be able to connect the dots. He hadn't counted on his scheme being audited by one of their past victims. They now had a direct, provable link between Marcus and a pattern of corporate fraud. It was their smoking gun. But Marcus was not one to go down quietly. On the third day, the counterattack came. A story planted by a public relations firm on retainer by Titan Equity appeared on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. The headline was brutal: "Fallen Titan, Adler's last-ditch delusions imperil pensioners, employees." The article painted Thomas as a senile, out-of-touch founder, clinging to a fantasy of solvency while his company crumbled. It quoted anonymous senior executives, undoubtedly Marcus's cronies, expressing grave concern for his mental state. It even contained a cruel, subtle reference to an unidentified young woman who was now exerting undue influence over the aging tycoon. The phones began to ring. Anxious investors, worried employees, even his daughter Charlotte, who hadn't spoken to him in months. "Dad, what is going on?" she demanded, her voice a mixture of concern and accusation. "Are you okay? People are saying you've lost your mind." "I'm more clear-headed than I've been in years, Charlotte," he said, the words catching in his throat. "I was betrayed. I'm fighting back." "Fighting back with a waitress from a coffee shop? Dad, this is what they're talking about. It sounds crazy." The conversation ended without resolution, leaving Thomas feeling more isolated than ever. The article was a masterful piece of character assassination. It wasn't just attacking his business, it was attacking his sanity, his credibility. Marcus and Titan were trying to discredit him so thoroughly that no one would listen to his accusations of fraud. That evening, as Thomas stared out at the city lights, the weight of the fight pressing down on him, Grace walked into his office. She held 2 mugs of tea. "He's good," she said, handing him a mug. "He knows that a fight in a courtroom takes time. A fight in the court of public opinion is faster and can be just as deadly." "He's making me look like a fool," Thomas said, his voice raw. "Only if you let him," Grace replied. She looked at him, not with pity, but with a challenge in her eyes. "You built an empire, Mr. Adler. You didn't do it by being quiet or by caring what other people whispered about you. You did it by being smarter, tougher, and more determined than everyone else in the room." "Where is that man?" Her words were a bracing slap. She was right. He had been playing defense, reacting to Marcus's moves. It was time to go on the offensive. The annual Adler Innovations Foundation Gala is in 3 days, Thomas said, a new idea beginning to form. It's our biggest charity event of the year. It was supposed to be canceled. The venue, the caterers, everything was being shut down. So uncancel it, Grace said, her eyes lighting up as she understood his train of thought. It's being held at the Crimson Oak, he said, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. Marcus will be there. He's been schmoozing the foundation's board for months, positioning himself to take it over after the company folded. He'll be there with his backers from Titan Equity, celebrating their victory. It's the perfect stage, Grace finished for him. Public, full of press, surrounded by the very people whose trust he's been trying to steal. But we need more than just the invoices from Skyline, Thomas said. We need an inside source, someone who can corroborate the story. Grace thought for a moment. When my father's company went under, his bookkeeper, a woman named Maria Sanchez, tried to help. She saw the fraud happening but was threatened into silence. She quit and was never able to work in the industry again. She told me once, the little people see everything, but no one ever asks us. Maybe we've been looking at the top of the pyramid. We need to look at the bottom. The next morning, they didn't go to the office. Thomas, using a list of recently terminated employees, made a call. An hour later, they were sitting in a small, tidy apartment in Queens, across from a nervous, middle-aged woman named Sarah Jenkins. Sarah had been Thomas's executive assistant for 20 years, before Marcus had her redundantly retired 3 months ago. At first, Sarah was hesitant, terrified of Marcus's retribution, but as Thomas spoke, not as a billionaire tycoon, but as a man who had also been cast aside, she began to soften. He thought I was just part of the furniture, Sarah said, her hands twisting a handkerchief. He used to hold meetings in his office with the door open. He'd talk on his speakerphone. He wasn't careful. He never thought I was listening. What did you hear, Sarah? Thomas asked gently. I heard him talking to a man from Titan Equity, Mr. Croft. They laughed about you, Mr. Adler. They called you the sentimental old fool. They talked about the shell corporations, about the bankruptcy. They called it the final act of the play. The day I was let go, I saw a document on Marcus's desk. It was a wire transfer confirmation, a consulting fee of $5 million from Titan Equity to a private account in his name. She started to cry softly. I knew it was wrong, but what could I do? I'm just a secretary. You are the key, Sarah, Grace said, her voice firm but kind. Your testimony changes everything. They spent the next hour with Sarah, documenting everything she had seen and heard. When they left her apartment, they had a signed affidavit. It was the final piece of the puzzle. They had the motive, the method, and now, the witness. It's time to set the stage, Thomas said as they got into the car. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and the trap would be sprung in the very place where it had all begun. The ballroom at the Crimson Oak was a symphony of crystal, silver, and muted gold. A string quartet played softly in the corner, its music a polite veneer over the hum of powerful conversations. 200 of New York's elite, financiers, philanthropists, and politicians, mingled, sipping champagne and making deals. This was supposed to have been the wake for Adler Innovations. Instead, Thomas Adler had, in a shocking move, reinstated it, sending out invitations just 24 hours prior. He stood near the entrance, not with the defeated slump of a ruined man, but with the ramrod posture of a general before a battle. Beside him, Grace Miller was almost unrecognizable. Gone was the waitress uniform and the severe ponytail. She wore a simple, elegant navy blue dress, her hair styled in soft waves. She looked poised and confident, but her eyes were constantly scanning the room, alert and watchful. They saw Marcus Thorne holding court near the center of the room, flanked by a brutish-looking man with cold, dead eyes whom Thomas recognized from newspaper photos as Julian Croft, the notoriously ruthless CEO of Titan Equity Group. Marcus was laughing, accepting condolences that sounded more like congratulations. He was the picture of a man who believed he had won. When he finally spotted Thomas and Grace, his laughter died. A look of pure shock, followed by contemptuous amusement, crossed his face. He and Croft began to make their way toward them. Thomas, Marcus said, his voice dripping with false concern, I'm surprised to see you here. I thought we agreed it was best to handle these things with dignity and privacy. Your definition of dignity seems to involve character assassination and fraud, Marcus. I prefer a more public approach, Thomas replied, his voice calm and caring, causing several nearby conversations to falter. Croft stepped forward, extending a hand to Thomas that he pointedly ignored. Julian Croft, I'm an admirer of your life's work, Mr. Adler. It's a tragedy what's happened. We're simply trying to preserve what's left of the company's value for the shareholders. The value you and Marcus have been systematically stripping for the last 18 months? Grace's voice cut through the pretense, sharp and clear. All eyes were now on their small group. Croft's gaze shifted to her, dismissive and cold. And you are? My name is Grace Miller, she said, meeting his stare without flinching. I'm Mr. Adler's new strategic advisor, and I'm the person who audited the bankruptcy documents you and Mr. Thorne so carefully prepared. A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. This was getting interesting. Marcus let out a condescending chuckle. Thomas, have you lost your mind? You're letting your little coffee shop conspiracy theorists speak for you now? This is pathetic. Is it pathetic, Marcus? Thomas's voice boomed through the now silent ballroom. He stepped forward, taking the center of the room. A waiter, pre-instructed, handed him a microphone from the podium. Or is it pathetic to betray the man who treated you like a son? To systematically bleed a company dry with fraudulent contracts to shell corporations? To conspire with a corporate predator to force a fraudulent bankruptcy so you could sell the assets for pennies on the dollar? The entire room was frozen, watching the drama unfold. Marcus's face had become a pale, tight mask of fury. Croft looked utterly unconcerned, as if watching a mildly interesting insect squirm. These are baseless, desperate accusations from a failed old man, Marcus spat into the silence. Are they? Grace said, stepping forward. In her hands, she held a tablet. Because I have here invoices from 4 of your shell corporations, Eris Consulting, Vectra Solutions, Apex Logistics, and Meridian Global, all billing for identical services, all established by you. A total of $32 million siphoned from Adler Innovations in just under 2 years. She swiped the screen. And I have the contracts with Skyline Contracting, a company known for racketeering, showing a pattern of fraudulent change orders and material surcharges, totaling another $15 million. A pattern, I might add, that they have used before to bankrupt other, smaller companies. Her eyes flickered with a personal fire. Croft laughed, a dry, grating sound. Circumstantial evidence. A good lawyer will tear that apart in minutes. You have nothing. Oh, but we do have something else, Thomas said. He gestured toward a side entrance. The doors opened, and Sarah Jenkins walked in, flanked by 2 formidable-looking men from Thomas's new legal team. She was terrified, but her expression was resolute. You all know Sarah Jenkins, Thomas announced to the crowd. My loyal assistant for 20 years. An assistant Marcus fired because she knew too much. Sarah, would you please tell our guests what you told us in your sworn affidavit? Sarah's voice trembled at first, but grew stronger as she spoke. I overheard Mr. Thorne on multiple occasions discussing the plan with Mr. Croft. The plan to manufacture a crisis, to devalue the assets, and to push Mr. Adler out. I also have records of a $5 million payment from a subsidiary of Titan Equity to Mr. Thorne's personal offshore account, dated the day the bankruptcy proposal was finalized. The dam broke. The ballroom erupted in a cacophony of gasps and shocked whispers. The press, who had been lingering at the back, surged forward, cameras flashing. Marcus stared at Sarah, his face a canvas of disbelief and pure hatred. He had never even considered her a threat. She was invisible, a ghost in his machine. You lying old hag, he screamed, losing the last shred of his composure. He took a menacing step toward her. Thomas's lawyers immediately moved to shield Sarah. Thomas himself stepped directly in front of Marcus, his eyes blazing with a righteous fury that had been simmering for months. It's over, Marcus. Croft, ever the pragmatist, saw the game was lost. He gave Marcus a look of utter disgust, turned to his associates and said, We're leaving. They began to push their way through the shocked crowd, offering no comment to the frantic reporters. Marcus was cornered, his reputation and freedom evaporating before his eyes. His handsome face was contorted in a snarl of desperation. He turned his rage on the one person he blamed for it all. "You!" he shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Grace. "You did this! You're nobody! A miserable little waitress! You ruined everything!" He lunged not at Thomas, but at Grace. It was a primal, desperate act of a cornered animal. But Thomas was ready. He shoved Marcus hard in the chest, sending him stumbling backward, right into the arms of two city detectives who had entered the ballroom discreetly moments before. "Marcus Thorne," one of the detectives said, his voice flat and official, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement, and wire fraud." As they cuffed him, Marcus's eyes, wild and full of hate, remained locked on Grace. The sheer venom in his gaze was chilling, but Grace didn't look away. She simply stood her ground, her expression calm, her posture unwavering. She had faced down the monster that had destroyed her family's life, and she had won. The ballroom was in chaos, but in the pandemonium in the ballroom was a living thing, a vortex of flashing lights and overlapping voices. But in the eye of this chaotic storm, where Marcus Thorne's venomous glare had been fixed just moments before, a strange and profound stillness descended upon Thomas Adler and Grace Miller. The acrid scent of ozone from the flashbulbs hung in the air, a metallic counterpoint to the sweet aroma of spilled champagne. Thomas felt a tremor run through his hand as he rested it on Grace's shoulder, a steadying gesture that felt more for his benefit than hers. He was suddenly acutely aware of his own mortality, the frantic drumming of his heart against ribs that felt brittle with age. He had not felt such a surge of adrenaline, of pure, righteous battle fury in 30 years. Now, in its ebbing, it left behind a bone-deep weariness that settled into his marrow like a fine silt. It wasn't over. He knew that with a certainty that chilled him more than Marcus's theatrical rage. This was not a checkmate. It was merely the end of the opening gambit in a war he was terrifyingly unprepared to fight. The public spectacle had decapitated the conspiracy, but the body of the beast, the crushing debt, the shattered supply chains, the terrified employees, the circling creditors, was still twitching, very much alive. "We should go." Grace's voice was low, cutting through his reverie. It was devoid of triumph, pitched with a pragmatism that was both unnerving and deeply comforting. She had not flinched, not once. When Marcus had lunged, her feet had remained planted, her spine straight. She had the stillness of someone who had already seen the worst and was unimpressed by its encores. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. His new legal team, a pair of pit bulls from a firm specializing in corporate warfare, materialized at their side, forming a human shield to carve a path through the clamoring press. Questions were hurled like stones. "Mr. Adler, is it true you're withdrawing the bankruptcy filing?" "Who is she, Mr. Adler?" "What's your next move?" Thomas ignored them all. His world had contracted to the few feet of polished floor in front of him. As they passed the grand podium, he saw the silver pen, Eleanor's pen, still lying next to the unsigned documents. A relic from a different timeline, a life he had almost surrendered. In that moment, he felt a pang not of victory, but of profound aching loss for the trust he had so willingly given, the blindness he had mistaken for faith. The first 48 hours were a descent into a specific kind of hell reserved for corporate triage. There was no sleep, only the cyclical consumption of bitter coffee that scoured the throat and frayed the nerves. They worked from a stark, glass-walled conference room in the law firm's midtown office, a neutral ground that felt more like a bunker. The numbers, when finally laid bare from the wreckage of Marcus's cooked books, were worse than they could have imagined. Marcus hadn't just been stealing, he had been setting fires. He had leveraged assets against short-term, high-interest loans from predatory lenders, allies of Titan equity, no doubt, creating a series of financial time bombs set to detonate within weeks. The company was not merely insolvent, it was booby-trapped. "They wanted it to be unsalvageable," Grace murmured on the second night, her face illuminated by the cold blue light of a dozen spreadsheets. Dark circles had bloomed under her eyes, but the eyes themselves were incandescent with focus. The plan wasn't just to buy the company for parts. The plan was to ensure that if anyone stopped the sale, the company would self-destruct anyway, It's scorched earth finance. That was when the real counterattack began. It wasn't public, like the Wall Street Journal article. It was silent, swift, and lethal. The consortium of banks that held Adler Innovations' primary line of credit, spooked by the chaos and likely pressured by allies of Croft, invoked a material adverse change clause. They weren't just freezing credit. They were calling in the entire $250 million loan, payable in 72 hours. It was a death sentence. The emergency board meeting was held via a frantic, multi-city video conference. The faces on the large screen were a gallery of panic and recrimination. Frank Peterson, the old industrialist who had clapped for grace, looked grim. Others were openly hostile. "This is a catastrophe, Thomas," yelled a hedge fund manager from Chicago. "Your little stunt at the gala has pushed us off a cliff. We should have taken the Titan deal. At least we would have walked away with something." "The Titan deal was a fiction designed to defraud you," Thomas retorted, his voice raspy with exhaustion. "And what is this? This is annihilation. $250 million in 3 days? It's impossible. You've killed us all with your pride." Thomas felt the last of his strength begin to fade. The man was right. It was impossible. He had won the moral victory, exposed the villain, but in doing so, he had triggered the very trap Marcus had set. He slumped in his chair, the weight of 40 years of work pressing down, ready to crush him into dust. Then Grace stood up. She walked to the whiteboard at the head of the room, her movements calm and deliberate. She was the only one in the room who wasn't shouting, the only one who didn't seem to be drowning. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice cutting cleanly through the noise. Every face on the screen turned toward her. "You are correct. We cannot find $250 million in liquid cash in 72 hours. The banks know this. This isn't a collection attempt. It is the final phase of the hostile takeover." She picked up a black marker. "They believe we see the company as a single entity, a monolith whose collapse is inevitable. They are mistaken." With swift, precise strokes, she began to draw. It wasn't a balance sheet. It was a battle map. Adler Innovations is not one company. It is a portfolio of assets, some toxic, some invaluable. She drew a circle around the hydro-ceramic patent. "This is our crown jewel. Its verifiable third-party valuation is north of $1 billion. But a sale takes months. We can't leverage it in time." She drew a line through it. "So we don't touch it." She drew another box. "This is our real estate portfolio. Over-leveraged by Marcus. Toxic. We let it go. We allow the banks to seize the headquarters building in Manhattan. A symbolic loss, but a tactical retreat. It satisfies a portion of their demand and costs us an asset that was draining capital." For the next hour, she dissected the company with the skill of a master surgeon. She spoke of selling off non-essential vehicle fleets, of spinning off the underperforming European distribution arm to its management team in a leveraged buyout, of pre-selling manufacturing capacity at a discount to their most loyal clients. It was a brutal, bloody strategy. It involved sacrifice, shrinkage, and pain. It was not a plan to save the company as it was. It was a plan to save its heart, its essential core of innovation and manufacturing, by amputating the limbs that Marcus had infected with gangrene. "It will be smaller," she concluded, setting down the marker. The whiteboard was a complex diagram of arrows, boxes, and crossed-out assets. "It will be humbled, but it will be alive. It will be solvent, and it will be ours." A stunned silence filled the room. She hadn't offered them a miracle. She had offered them something far more valuable, a credible path through an impossible situation, a way to fight. Thomas stared at her, then at the board. The panic in his chest had been replaced by a nascent, unfamiliar feeling. It wasn't the arrogant confidence of his youth, but a quiet, fierce hope forged in the crucible of absolute despair. He found his voice. "This is the plan," he said, his old authority returning. "We vote now. All in favor of proceeding with Miss Miller's restructuring strategy?" One by one, the hands went up. Even the man from Chicago. The war for Adler Innovations had truly begun. In the midst of the corporate maelstrom, life continued its inexorable personal march. A week after the board meeting, Thomas found his daughter, Charlotte, waiting for him outside the law firm. She looked tired, her face etched with a worry that pained him more than any creditor's threat. "Dad," she said, her voice tight, "can we talk?" They walked to a small, sterile parquet wedged between skyscrapers. The roar of the city was a constant, indifferent backdrop. "I saw the news," she began, not looking at him. "The arrests, the gala, all of it. I'm glad you fought back." She finally met his eyes, and he saw the conflict there. "But Dad, what are you doing? The papers are calling you a madman. They say you're liquidating the company, destroying your own legacy to prove a point. Are you okay?" It was the same question she had asked on the phone, but the tone was different. The accusation was gone, replaced by genuine, fearful concern. He saw himself through her eyes, an old man, gambling the family name, advised by a woman half his age who had, a month ago, been serving him coffee. "I've never been better, Charlotte," he said, and was surprised to find he meant it. "And I've never been worse." He took a breath, deciding in that moment to abandon all pretense. "I failed, not just the company. I failed you. I failed your mother. I built this massive, glittering thing, and I let it consume me. I put my trust in the wrong person because he reflected the part of me I liked best, the ambitious, ruthless builder. I didn't see that he lacked the one thing that turns ambition into creation instead of destruction, a soul." He reached out and took her hand. It felt small and fragile in his. "I'm not trying to save my legacy, sweetheart. I'm trying to dismantle a monument to my own ego and see if there's a workshop left inside, a place where good people can still build good things. That's all." Tears welled in Charlotte's eyes. "I miss Mom," she whispered. "She would have known what to do." "She would have," Thomas agreed, his own throat tightening. "She would have seen right through Marcus in a second, and she would have adored Grace." It was the first time they had spoken of Eleanor, of their shared grief, in years. It wasn't a solution or an absolution, but it was a beginning. As they sat in silence watching the anonymous city rush past, a small, fractured piece of his broken world began to knit itself back together. Grace found her own moment of reckoning in the quiet of her tiny apartment. Long after midnight, an email had arrived, an official letter bearing the crest of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It was a full, unconditional offer to return and complete her doctorate, funded by a newly endowed chair in her name for the study of ethical economics. The endowment, the letter noted, had been made anonymously. She sank onto her sofa, the letter trembling in her hand. This was it, the door back to her old life, the life that had been stolen from her, the future she had mourned like a lost love. She could picture it so clearly, the quiet intensity of the lecture halls, the scent of old books in the library, the elegant purity of a perfectly balanced equation. A world of theory and intellect, a world away from the grit and grime and brutal compromises of their current battle. She thought of her father. She remembered the day he had closed the doors to his construction company for the last time. He hadn't raged. He had simply sat at their kitchen table, his big, capable hands that could frame a house and fix any engine, lying still and defeated on the worn Formica. "The numbers beat me, Gracie," he had said, his voice hollow. "They just used numbers like a club until I stopped moving." Marcus Thorne and his ilk had not been brought down by an elegant theory. They had been brought down by a stubborn, furious refusal to be beaten, by digging through receipts in a dusty archive, by tracking IP addresses, by talking to a forgotten secretary, by fighting in the mud. Her work with Thomas wasn't clean or pure. It was a messy, desperate street fight with spreadsheets as the weapons. She looked around her small apartment. On her coffee table sat a small framed photo of her father, standing proudly in front of a half-finished building, a smile on his face. Victory hadn't brought him back. It wouldn't erase the years of struggle that had worn him down and contributed to his early death. But as she looked at his picture, she felt a sense of peace settle over her that had been absent for years. It wasn't the triumphant peace of a victor. It was the quiet peace of a debt repaid. She had not just fought for Thomas Adler. She had fought for John Miller. She had taken the club of numbers and used it to strike back. Her life's work, she realized, might not be in a classroom, predicting the storm. It might be right here, in the heart of it, building a seawall. 1 year later, the air in the New Jersey plant hummed with a different kind of energy. It was the sound of controlled, purposeful creation. The layoffs had been painful, the restructuring brutal, but those who remained worked with the fierce pride of owners. Because now they were. In a move that the financial press had called both insane and revolutionary, the newly stabilized Adler Innovations had been rechartered, with 40% of its equity placed in an employee stock ownership plan. Thomas and Grace walked the factory floor, not as executives on a tour, but as partners in a shared enterprise. Thomas had shed the bespoke suits for a simple work shirt and slacks. He seemed to have aged, the lines on his face deeper, but the frantic, hunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a calm, steady light. He knew the names of the machinists, asked about their children, debated the tolerances on a new bearing with the floor supervisor. He was no longer a king on a distant throne. He was a master craftsman back in his workshop. They stopped by a massive, state-of-the-art CNC machine, the first major capital investment the new company had made. It was being installed to manufacture components for the hydroceramic composite. "Frank Peterson called me a sentimental old fool for this," Thomas said, running a hand over the machine's cool steel housing. "Said we should have licensed the patent and sat back and collected the checks for the next 20 years. "Frank Peterson is a financier," Grace replied, watching a young engineer calibrate the machine's laser guidance system. "He sees assets. He doesn't see potential." "And what do you see?" Thomas asked, turning to her. "I see a future," she said simply. "One we build ourselves." He smiled, a genuine, easy smile. "I had a call from the dean at MIT," he said, his tone casual. He expressed his profound disappointment that the first recipient of the prestigious Grace Miller Chair has decided to defer her academic career indefinitely. He seemed to think I had something to do with it. Grace met his gaze, her own eyes sparkling with amusement. "I told them my research had unexpectedly moved from the theoretical to the applied, and that my current lab partner, while occasionally stubborn, provided fascinating data." "Cheeky," he chuckled. "You know, I started this company with $20,000 and a belief that you could build a better world if you just built a better bolt. Somewhere along the way, I started to care more about the size of the building than what it was built with." "You didn't just save the company, Grace. You reminded me what it was for?" He paused, his expression turning serious. "The board officially ratified the succession plan yesterday. When I do decide to step back, it's yours. All of it." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, of a trust so absolute it was humbling. "I know," she said softly. Her gaze drifted across the bustling floor, across the faces of the men and women who now owned a piece of their own labor. "My father lost his business because he was alone. No one ever had his back." She looked back at Thomas, her mentor, her partner, her friend. "I think our work is to build a company where everyone has someone watching their back. We'll protect this. Together." "Thomas," he said, the name a gentle offering. "My friends call me Thomas." "Thomas," she repeated, testing the name. It felt right. He nodded, a sense of profound rightness settling over him. He had begun that year preparing to sign an ending. He now stood firmly in the middle of a new beginning, written not with the silver pen of a gilded past, but forged in the fire of near ruin, alongside the most unlikely and extraordinary of queens. And for the first time in a very long time, he was not afraid to see what the next chapter held.